Welcome to This Explainer. Look, we're leaving the Hollywood vampire myths at the door today. Forget the garlic, forget the sunlight, and definitely forget the immortal cape-wearing monster. We are diving straight into the actual flesh and blood history of Vlad Dracula. We're going to explore a real-world historical warlord whose sheer calculated brutality and mastery of psychological warfare literally terrified the greatest empire on Earth. We'll see exactly how a minor prince used utter ruthlessness to forge a legacy that outlasted empires. Because honestly, the truth of his life is way more compelling and way scarier than the fiction it inspired. Let's get into it. To kick things off, I want you to imagine this historical anomaly for a second. How exactly does a ruler completely wipe out crime overnight? According to our sources, right in the middle of his capital city, a solid gold cup was left out in the open by a public well. Anybody could use it for a drink. Any thief could have just slipped it into their cloak and walked away a rich man. But here's the crazy part. For years, not a single person ever dared to lay a finger on it. Crime just vanished. Under his rule, merchants traded honesty, and towns became perfectly, almost weirdly safe and orderly. So what's the secret? Well, it definitely wasn't progressive laws, or some kind of utopian policy, or kind mercy. The answer was pure, absolute terror. The social order in his kingdom was held together entirely by this constant, suffocating shadow of fear. It was the paralyzing dread of what one single man would do to you if you crossed him, even in the absolute tiniest way. He punished his enemies and wrongdoers in ways so agonizingly horrific that everyday people literally preferred to leave a fortune in gold sitting completely unguarded in the town square, rather than risk wreaking his wrath. To really wrap our heads around this historical monster, we've got to start with the name itself, Dracula. It literally translates to son of the dragon. And no, this wasn't some spooky nickname invented for a late-night ghost story. It came directly from his father, who was part of a secret holy brotherhood called the Order of the Dragon. This order was sworn to defend their lands against encroaching empires, basically at any cost. So young Vlad was raised on this incredibly heavy, dangerous legacy. From his very childhood, he was taught that his bloodline was sworn to fight, to bleed, and to rule the harsh, unforgiving borderlands of Wallachia. Moving on to his origins. If you want to understand the man, you have to look at how he was built. Back in 1442, just to prove his loyalty, Vlad's father had to hand him and his brother over to the Ottoman Sultan as living hostages. Just think about that. Vlad was a young kid, trapped in an enemy court, constantly watched, his life literally hanging by a thread. And while he was there, he secretly witnessed brutal public executions, including victims being placed on tall wooden stakes. That very specific horror permanently burned itself into his developing mind. Then, in 1447, unthinkable trauma hits. His father is assassinated by treacherous nobles back home, and his older brother is buried alive. You can imagine the cold, calculating hatred that filled his heart. By the time he finally returned to seize the Wallachian throne in 1456, he wasn't that frightened hostage anymore. He was a ruthless survivor coming back to collect a terrible debt. And man, did he collect. When Vlad finally took power, he didn't just quietly execute the nobles who betrayed his family. No, he engineered an absolute masterpiece of revenge. He invited them, along with their families, to this magnificent Easter feast. Hundreds of nobles show up in their absolute finest clothes, suspecting absolutely nothing, thinking they're just celebrating with their new prince. But right as the laughter and eating peaked in the grand hall, Vlad's guards suddenly surrounded the tables. In one swift moment, the party became a cold, merciless trap. He marched the older nobles in chains straight up into the treacherous mountains and forced them into brutal, back-breaking labor to build his cliff-top fortress of Ponari. They worked under the whip until their fine, silk clothes literally rotted right off their backs. His style of diplomacy? Exactly the same level of brutality. You've probably heard this story, but it is wild. When proud Ottoman envoys arrived at his court to basically remind this minor prince who his masters were, they famously refused to remove their turbans, citing their sacred customs. Vlad's response was chilling. He basically said, well, I'll make certain you never have to take them off again. He ordered his guards to seize the men and had their turbans nailed directly to their skulls. This wasn't just a random burst of anger. It was a horrific, calculated act of psychological warfare meant to assert total dominance and send a crystal-clear, bloody message straight back to the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, when word of this atrocity reached Sultan Mehmed II, the guy who literally conquered Constantinople, his fury was absolute. He immediately demanded massive financial tribute and total submission. But Vlad literally crushed the demand in his fist. Against all conventional logic, he consciously chose open war with the greatest empire on earth over a single day of obedience. Now, he knew exactly what kind of apocalyptic storm he was inviting. Wallachia was a tiny principality, massively outgunned and outnumbered. Yet, Vlad started rallying every single man in his country for a desperate fight against totally impossible odds. He wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't fight a colossal Ottoman army head-on. So he pivoted to completely ruthless, asymmetrical warfare. He essentially turned his own land into a weapon. Step 1, a devastating scorched earth retreat. He burned his own villages to the ground and poisoned the local wells, meaning the advancing enemy was marching into a barren wasteland, completely starving and exhausted. Then, under the cover of pitch black, he launched his infamous night attack. He and his men tore through the Sultan's sleeping camp with fire and absolute fury, actively hunting for the Sultan's own tent. And then, just as quickly as they struck, they completely vanished back into the dark forests before the massive Ottoman army could even organize a defense. It left the invaders completely shaken, confused, and deeply humiliated. But believe it or not, the most terrifying tactic was still waiting for them. As the Ottomans pushed deeper and deeper into Wallachia, this unnatural, suffocating dread started creeping over the ranks. Picture this. A scout riding ahead of the main column suddenly just freezes in his tracks. Vlad had left a little welcome message marking the approach to his capital. It was a vast, seemingly endless field containing thousands upon thousands of impaled bodies. The sheer, incomprehensible scale of the carnage was an absolute nightmare. It was deliberately constructed to completely shatter the minds of his enemies before a single sword was even swung. The sight was so uniquely horrifying that hardened, battle-tested veteran soldiers were openly weeping and turning away in disgust. Even the all-powerful Sultan Mehmed himself sat completely frozen on his horse, shaken to his absolute core by the sheer magnitude of the horror laid out right in front of him. Realizing that he was fighting a man who would go to such unimaginable lengths, the Sultan actually ordered his colossal army to turn around and retreat. The absolute greatest military force in the world at that time had been defeated. Not by swords, not by superior numbers, but entirely by pure, weaponized psychological terror. For a brief moment there, Vlad stood at the absolute height of his power, a rogue warlord who had successfully defied an empire. But his triumph didn't last, and the ultimate betrayal came from his own blood. His brother Radu, who was fiercely loyal to the Ottomans, used Turkish gold to quietly buy off the local nobles and turn them against Vlad. Outnumbered and abandoned, Vlad was driven all the way back to his cliff-top fortress at Poinari. It was there that tragedy struck. Legend has it his wife leaped from the high tower into the freezing river below just to avoid capture. Vlad, ever the survivor, actually escaped through the treacherous mountains by brilliantly fitting his horses with backwards horseshoes to leave false tracks. I mean, brilliant, right? He fled to the king of Hungary, desperately seeking help, only to be betrayed yet again with forged letters and thrown into a dark prison for 12 long years. Now, even locked away in a lonely cell for over a decade, historical sources note this really chilling detail about his deeply fractured psyche. He apparently spent his endless empty days obsessively carving tiny wooden stakes, and he would capture and impale small birds and mice that wandered into his cell. Just let that sink in. His dark nature, forged by that traumatic youth, and his brutal reign, simply never left him. The Prince of Terror might have been in a cage, but his mind remained completely fixated on the very acts of violence that had defined his entire existence. Fast forward 12 long years, and the King of Hungary finally frees him. Why? Because they desperately needed the one warrior the Turks still truly feared to lead their armies once again. Older, hardened, but completely unbroken, Vlad rides back to reclaim his blood-soaked throne. He led his loyal men through frozen winter forests, but his luck finally ran out. In that final clash, he was surrounded and killed on a silent field of snow. And his enemies, taking absolutely no chances this time, cut off his head and carried it all the way back to the Sultan, preserved in a jar of honey. It was literally the only way to provide absolute, undeniable proof to the empire that their greatest nightmare was truly dead and gone.
So, 4 centuries later, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker borrows his fearsome name and creates the fictional vampire we all know today. You know the drill, a monster that drinks blood, fears sunlight, and lives forever in some gothic castle. But when we strip all that popular fiction away, we see the real historical warlord. We find a master strategist who pioneered unprecedented psychological terror, a flesh and blood prince who fought completely impossible odds, weaponized fear, and defended his tiny country from the greatest empire of his age using nothing but his brilliant, twisted mind.
Which brings us to a final thought for this explainer, and it's a question worth pondering. Is history's truth actually much darker than our favorite fiction? Look, the real Dracula didn't drink blood, and he certainly didn't care about the morning sun. But knowing what he actually did to secure his survival, knowing the sheer, calculated brutality he unleashed on thousands of human beings just to defend his borders, isn't the flesh and blood prince far more terrifying than any supernatural monster we could possibly invent?